make sure to give my dad a 5-star review.
Make sure to like and subscribe to his YouTube. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Yeah, so, one of the big ways that this movement has influenced government is through school boards, and that is certainly the case in Lancaster. I mentioned that one church that has a lot of representation in local school boards, and there are also a few other NAR-aligned churches that have school board members as well. And just recently, these NAR-controlled or NAR-affiliated school boards have brought in this group called the Independence Law Center, which is a kind of a local arm of the Family Research Council. It's a local legal arm of the Family Research Council. And the reason that they've brought in this group is to introduce rules in the local school districts against trans athletes participating in women's sports.
Hey, welcome back, Faithful Politics listeners and watchers. If you're watching on our YouTube channel, I am your political host, Will Wright, and your faithful host, Pastor Josh Bertram, is off doing stuff that God would want him to do. But this week we have with us Kiera Butler. She's a senior editor at Mother Jones, covers health, science, and education and misinformation online. She's reported on QAnon's use of anti-vaccine rhetoric to target moms, anti-abortion groups, spreading health myths on social media, and the ties between white nationalists and anti-vaccine movements. And her work has been featured all over the place, to include NPR, MSNBC, New York Times, and we are so honored to have her here today to talk to us about her latest story, dealing with Christian nationalism. So, welcome to the show, Kiera.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure, and we want to start first by just getting a better sense of how did you get involved in this world, maybe you could start first with journalism, and then you can kind of go into the wonderful world of faith and politics combined.
Sure. So I've been at Mother Jones for 17 years. So I started there when I was a baby journalist, and I have covered a bunch of different things at Mother Jones. I started out writing more about the environment and science and health. During the pandemic, health kind of led me into health conspiracy theories, which kind of led me into political conspiracy theories and far-right extremist groups. And from there, I began to learn more about the new Apostolic Reformation, this kind of growing, influential, charismatic Christian movement that has become very kind of entwined with the MAGA crowd. And through them, I learned about other kinds of Christian nationalist movements as well.
It's so wild. One of the things that Josh and I talk about on the show sometimes is when we started this podcast, we started 4 years ago. I've always been into politics. Josh has always been into religion. We named our show Faithful Politics somewhat as ignorant, just people starting podcasts, not knowing that the ties were so close. and as we started having guests on, they start talking about Christian nationalism and then the new Apostolic Reformation. And we're just like, what did we, end up in? And it's been a wild journey. And I envy you. I envy you for jumping into this. Definitely.
Well, it certainly is an interesting world. And like you said, that, the connections between faith and politics, there's so many of them that I never realized were there before. It's such rich terrain. And, even beyond the kind of extremism aspects that I've been focusing on, there are all kinds of fruitful relationships between religious leaders and political leaders that are so interesting and rich to dive into.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit more about the new Apostolic Reformation and what are some of the things that you've learned, you've uncovered, and why are they relevant right now?
So I started hearing about the New Apostolic Reformation several years ago, right after the Stop the Steal campaign, after the 2020 election. As your listeners probably know, some of the key orchestrators of that movement were part of the New Apostolic Reformation. They were these folks who call themselves apostles and prophets. They, say that God speaks to them in dreams, and where that movement was concerned, they actually began to say that Trump had been anointed by God, and that the election being stolen from him had been sort of an act against God in that way. So that was my introduction to the movement. And this year, as we have another election coming up, I wanted to see what this movement looked like on the ground. We've kind of looked at what it looks like on the national political stage, but I wondered what it looked like, in communities across the country. And so I traveled to Lancaster, Pennsylvania. This is kind of an NAR stronghold. There are some powerful apostles there, and there are some churches that kind of have outsized influence, I would say, in local politics there. And in addition to the politics aspect of it, the NAR folks are kind of woven into the fabric of society there. These are the folks who are running the food banks. These are the folks who are providing housing assistance for needy folks there. These are also the folks who are going to public schools and doing baptisms. So it's almost impossible in a place like Lancaster County to separate out regular civic life from this NAR movement.
Now, my wife is from northern Indiana and has spent lots of time and lived actually in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So from what she's told me, there's a lot of, Amish, a lot of Mennonite community up there. And now you're telling me that there's a pretty rich and dense NAR community up there as well.
Yeah. And actually something that was surprising to me when I went there was the extent of overlap between the Amish and Anabaptist communities and the NAR communities. There are a lot of former Amish turned NAR people. I had this really fascinating experience there. I went to just this massive food pantry distribution center. This is a place, it was just this enormous warehouse chock full of food. And this group works with food manufacturers to get their surplus and bring that surplus to food pantries and food banks so that needy people can get food. And this place is just, it's wild. It's bags of frozen nacho cheese next to giant vats of cereal, just everything you can imagine. And it's run by this guy who dresses Amish and used to be Amish, but with his, I think, 6 or 7 brothers, was kind of radicalized by a NAR preacher and felt that he was called to do this food distribution thing, and now exists in this kind of world between, he still dresses Amish and he still has some Amish values, but he is very much part of this NAR world as well. And he was telling us that he does this work because he feels like it gives him an opportunity to tell the folks who use this food distribution center about NAR principles, about Jesus. So, that just putting that out there is the kind of thing that you might see in Lancaster.
That's so wild. Okay, so you spent some time in Lancaster. They had was it a revival kind of atmosphere? Was it a political event? What were they doing there?
I went to a few different things there. It wasn't one main event. We actually tried to find one main event. And since I took my reporting trip in, I guess it was maybe August, September. Anyway, there have been many events since then, including an event nearby, not in Lancaster itself, but nearby, featuring J.D. Vance. But when I was there, I went to a few smaller things. So I went to a few NAR-aligned churches to see what their church services were like. And I also went to one of the churches has a house of prayer where people are praying 24/7. And I went to what they called a government watch night there. So they had a group of, it wasn't that many people, it was probably like 20 to 30 people praying for the government. And this is a charismatic group. So they were speaking in tongues, they were blowing shofars. This is the ancient Israelite ram's horn instrument that in the Bible was, used to call the Israelite troops to battle. It's become a kind of a NAR thing, a symbol. Mm-hmm. They brought their shofars in these like special carrying cases, and they were talking about the importance of Trump and the importance of Israel. They're really into Israel, and they were kind of mixing this charismatic style of prayer with this kind of very fiery political rhetoric and kind of culture war rhetoric. They were talking about, the scourge of LGBTQ ideology. They were asking Jesus to rid them of that. It was interesting.
I mean, we've had several people on to talk about the New Apostolic Reformation, and I swear it never ceases to surprise me, like when folks are just explaining about it, because it's a theology that I don't necessarily agree with. I'm familiar with some elements of it because, I wasn't raised in the church. I came to the faith much later in life, but like being in churches where there's like shofars playing, people speaking in tongues. Like I've always been envious of people that can blow those shofars because I just don't have the lung capacity to do it. So you go shofar players, but who's leading? Like who was leading kind of this whole, NAR activation there in Lancaster?
Well, there is in Harrisburg. There's a very prominent NAR church, and there's an apostle. There are actually maybe two apostles there who are very high up in NAR leadership. And I guess it's important to say about NAR that it's a kind of a loose network more than it is. It's not like the Catholic Church where you have the Pope and then there's the bishops, and then it's not really an organized hierarchical structure like that exactly. You have people who are, saying that they're prophets and that God has spoken to them in dreams. And then you have, these kind of unaffiliated evangelical churches who will end up following one prophet or apostle or another. So it's not, I don't know, it's a little bit, it makes it tricky to kind of pin down, because when you ask folks at these churches, like this one of these churches that I went to in Lancaster, like, which apostles are you following? They might say to you like, well, what are you talking about? Like, we're just doing our own thing. And like, that apostle, like that's somebody who we're close with. We have a relationship with them, but we're not under them. And it honestly, like most people who are associated with this movement, if you say the words New Apostolic Reformation to them, they'll say, maybe they've heard of that, but they'll say, no, that's not us. Even if they're associating with these folks who are very high up in the movement. So, when you ask who the leader is, it's a little bit of a tricky question to answer.
Yeah, but are there like one of the names I hear often associated with that is like Lance Walnow, and Che and some other names. Like were these people or the names I mentioned, like, are those folks that are known kind of throughout the NAR community?
Yeah, especially Lance Walnow. I would say almost everybody that I talked to during my reporting in Lancaster and elsewhere was familiar with Lance Walnow. Lance Walnow he's a former business strategist, and he's kind of a brilliant communicator. For the story that I wrote, I talked to Fred Clarkson, who's an extremism and religion researcher with Political Research Associates. He's kind of an expert on NAR. And I think it was Fred Clarkson who really helped me see why Lance Walnow was so successful in kind of transmitting the principles of this movement. Lance Walnow was really the one who popularized one of the central tenets of the New Apostolic Reformation, which is the Seven Mountain Mandate. Broadly, this is the idea that Christians are called to exert their influence or take dominion over all parts of society. And they say there are 7 parts of society, and I'm not going to be able to name them. I always forget one, but some of them are government, education, arts and culture, media. There are others too. But Lance Walnow, I think, his training as a business strategist, he really was able to take that idea of the 7 mountains and make it very accessible to folks. It's a very useful metaphor. If you're trying to explain, if you're a pastor and you're trying to explain to your congregation about, the idea of Christian dominionism, breaking it up into these 7 mountains that you conquer, it's a really powerful way to describe that. And I think that's one of the reasons that Lance Walnow became so prominent in this movement.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if, you mentioned earlier that some people may not necessarily realize that they are like a part of this new Apostolic Reformation. And that's just fascinating to me. So like when you explain to them, hey, these, people that subscribe to the New Apostolic Reformation believe the following, that we have to have dominion over these 7 mountains, that Trump is like the King Cyrus resurrected, how do people respond? If you haven't had those conversations with them, that's fine. I still would love to kind of get your impact about like your input.
Yeah. So, one of the folks that I had a really fascinating conversation with was a pastor at another church in Lancaster. This is a church that has several of its members serve on school boards around there. They were involved in the campaign to elect Mastriano, who was a NAR guy who was running for office in Pennsylvania 2 years ago. And, before I talked to this pastor, who's like a really friendly guy, and he sent me this video that was about, he said it was a good way of explaining how he thinks about Christianity. And it was a guy who used the metaphor of a mall food court, right? And, he was saying pastors can pick and choose from different food stalls in the mall food court of Christianity. And you might take a little from this and a little from that. And the folks who are saying that the New Apostolic Reformation is kind of taking over or exerting outsized influence are not understanding the fact that, Christianity is really just this buffet where you can pick and choose. So, I went and I talked to this guy, and he was, talking about Lance Walnow, talking about Dutch sheets, talking about spiritual warfare, which is, a concept that NAR folks are really, that's a very important concept to them. He was talking about the 7 Mountains Mandate. Like, this guy, he really seemed like he was a NAR subscriber. And then, I wrote my piece. I sent it to him. I said, "What'd you think?" And he said, "I can't believe you chose to focus on NAR. That's such a red herring. It's not even a thing." And I wrote to him. I was like, "Well, you were saying all this stuff and all these people believe all of these things. And there's this network of people. And he was like, yeah, it's not important. We're just Christians. So, there's a way that you can kind of, I don't know, explain it away as like, because it's so loose, because it's a network and it's not really it's not a denomination. You can make yourself as close to it or as distant from it as you want,
Yeah. That's really interesting. Like, folks like you, other journalists we've had on, folks, that we've read do tend to make the NAR kind of a huge issue. And for me, I think for good reason, especially if you bring in the January 6th stuff and then the Trump stuff and all that. It's almost like a political movement disguising itself as theology. In essence, where people are subscribing to it, they're like, yeah, it's just like, that's just kind of what we believe, like Christians believe in all kinds of weird stuff, this is just another one of those things. So like how do you reconcile with, people, with their deeply held beliefs that are sort of colored by a variety of different factors, and also just this lack of awareness that they are being used or being included as a part of something much bigger than they even realize.
I mean, some people call NAR network Christianity, and they kind of liken it to a pyramid scheme. I don't think it's a perfect comparison because it's not. I think that pyramid schemes are probably more well organized and more hierarchical than NAR. But, I think what you do see in both of these kinds of movements, pyramid schemes and NAR, is they offer people a kind of a sense of belonging, a sense that you are part of something, and, even if you're not calling it NAR, the idea that you are called by God to engage in spiritual warfare, and that Christians have a divine mission to take over all of society, including the government. And that, if you listen to these folks who say that God is speaking directly to them, that feeling that sense of importance, I think really is a powerful thing. And in a way, it doesn't matter what you call that, because for people who are involved in the movement, it's meaningful, no matter what label you give it, if that makes sense.
It does, and I'm curious with the concentration there in Lancaster, were you able to see any, direct results of their activism? In the community, given that, NAR folks believe in, 7 Mountains Mandate and all the different mountains that includes, were you able to see, influences in either education, I don't know, government, what have you, when you're there?
Yeah. So, one of the big ways that this movement has influenced government is through school boards. And that is certainly the case in Lancaster. I mentioned that one church that has a lot of representation in local school boards. And there are also a few other NAR-aligned churches that have school board members as well. And just recently, these NAR-controlled or NAR-affiliated school boards have brought in this group called the Independence Law Center, which is a kind of a local arm of the Family Research Council. It's a local legal arm of the Family Research Council. And the reason that they've brought in this group is to introduce rules in the local school districts against trans athletes participating in women's sports. And so, I think it's something like a quarter of the school districts in Lancaster have this happening right now. And to me, that is one of the most kind of salient, concrete examples of how this religious movement actually is influencing politics. The other thing that I will say, though, is that, like I was saying about this formerly Amish, now NAR guy who runs the food distribution center, he told us very transparently. He was like, and when I say us, I went with a reporter from Reveal, the radio show, and we have also done a Reveal episode, which is out now, about this. So it was the two of us talking to this guy, and so this guy was, he was saying that he believes that government should not be involved in social services. The idea is to replace government-run, government-funded social services with Christian social services. So, the school boards are one example, but if you kind of look closely, it's almost like it's just everywhere in this community.
Wow, that's so crazy. You didn't happen to mention to him that the Black Panthers actually used to provide like school breakfasts to communities to them, did you?
No, I didn't.
Be like, that's a great idea, like kind of like what the Black Panthers did. And they'll be like, whoa, hold on. Pump the brakes, buddy.
Maybe for a follow-up interview with him. I'll mention that.
That's right. That's right. So you wrote another article that I want to talk to you about regarding Theo Bros. And this is a term that I've been hearing more and more, and it's a term that I've not used ever in my entire life. And I would love for you just to kind of talk a little bit about like, what the heck is a Theo Bro?
So I can't claim that term as my own. It was actually an academic that I talked to, like a person who studies religious extremism in an academic capacity, used that term. And when I was interviewing her, and I was like, wow, that's really good. It seemed to encapsulate this movement because, basically this is a movement of bros. It's these young, mostly millennial Christian guys who they follow the Reformed tradition, or, some people think of this more as like Calvinist. These are not NAR people. They don't believe in charismatic Christianity. They're a much more kind of staid group. So anyway, this is a group of young Reformed Christian guys. And although they are young and extremely online, they're on Twitter all the time. They have podcasts, they have conferences where they all invite each other to their many, many, many conferences, and then, the YouTube broadcasts. And they're very fashionable. They have their suits are very well tailored. They kind of make fun of the kind of older, stodgy, like pleated khaki wearing Christian guys. They're really into working out. There's some kind of like manosphere, like Andrew Tate stuff going on with them. But despite their youthfulness, they are actually much more conservative and militant than their older counterparts. And I always think it's important to point out about these guys that not all of them hold every belief, but some of the most common beliefs that I've seen in this crowd are: they want to repeal the 19th Amendment. That was the amendment that gave women the right to vote. They talk about prison reform, but by prison reform, they mean bringing back public flogging instead of prison sentences.
Oh my gosh.
They believe that the U.S. Constitution is dead, and that it should be replaced by the Ten Commandments. Many of them believe that interracial, interethnic marriage is a sin. They're very into talking about the kind of cultural heritage of America. And they say explicitly that America is a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant nation. So that's the Theo Bros in a nutshell.
I'm like, as you're listing those out, I'm like, well, I'm in an interracial marriage. Okay. So that one works against me.
Right. Me too. Yeah.
I'm like checking the boxes. I'm like, dang, this group sounds like worse than the NAR for somebody like me. But like, what's the origin story? Like, why? I mean, like I think with New Apostolic Reformation, you could almost kind of trace it. That there is sort of a throughput line to some of the folks that you mentioned. But like, what's the rationale or the origin for the Theo Bros?
Well, part of the origin has to do with this kind of Calvinist revival, this kind of Reformed movement. But I would say kind of the patriarch of the movement is this guy, Doug Wilson. He is a pastor in Moscow, Idaho. And over the last, 30, 40 years, he's kind of made Moscow, Idaho into his own little Christian fiefdom. He has this church there. He helped start this K through 12 Christian classical school. He helped start this college, New St. Andrews College. He has a printing press there, like a publisher there. It's remarkable what he's been able to achieve. And at this point, he's like in his 70s, and he has kids who are millennials, and they have kind of helped him take his message and make it very kind of fun and palatable for a younger generation. So he does this thing every year called No Quarter November, where he makes all these videos about, where he just says exactly what he thinks with no thought toward, not offending people or being politically correct. And he now makes these like trailer videos for No Quarter November. And they are like over the top, kitschy content. Like in the latest one, there might be a new one now, actually, because it's almost November. But the one for 2023, he like puts on a flamethrower and like shoots flames at like the Instagram, like a big cardboard cutout of like Disney princesses and like the Instagram logo. It's just, it's wild and it's very well done. It's like very slick and very fun. So he's had such success in Moscow that I think a lot of the younger Theo Bros really want to emulate him. So you have, folks in Ogden, Utah, who are trying to make Ogden into their own Christian fiefdom. And then you have these guys at this company called New Founding, who are buying up tracts of land in Appalachia and trying to turn those into Christian communities. So it's really become this whole movement. And it, I guess talking about New Founding also reminded me that there are deep ties between the Theo Bros and Silicon Valley. There are, a number of, Silicon Valley and the Republican Party, but basically, there are a number of these guys who have come through the Claremont Institute, which is this kind of Silicon Valley-aligned Republican think tank. And several of them have also become involved with this thing called the Rockbridge Network, which is a kind of Republican donor organization that is bankrolled in part by Peter Thiel. This is the Silicon Valley billionaire, and J.D. Vance. And there are actually, photos of these Theo Bro guys from New Founding and the kind of related Theo Bro magazine, American Reformer, with J.D. Vance. And so, there's this kind of web of connections between Silicon Valley folks and GOP folks and Theo Bros. It really is more extensive than I think a lot of people realize.
I'm really glad you mentioned the flamethrower thing because I was on Doug Wilson's website the other day. I was actually trying to find contact information because I wanted to invite him on the show. And there was a shop where they sold like a flamethrower. And I was like, this is an odd thing to have on a website. It was sold out, but I'm like, this is an odd thing. Like, why would you've got like books, like all kinds of books, and then like a flamethrower. And I'm like, okay, weird, but now that makes total sense.
But now you get it. Yeah, I mean, the merch, the Theo Bros merch is really something. There's another Theo Bro who, with his wife, I guess, they sell like mugs and aprons that say "Feed the Patriarchy." And they're very into, like, non-ironically into the idea of the patriarchy.
Oh my gosh. I'm laughing because I actually know people that would buy stuff like that, which probably says more about me than it does them. But but speaking of JD Vance, I am kind of curious, like, do you get the sense that JD Vance's rise and, his selection as Trump's running mate is intentional to kind of target, these folks, or is his connection to the Theo Bros sort of, happen after he was chosen as their running mate?
That's a really good question. I don't think it happened afterwards. JD Vance spoke at the National Conservatism Conference this past summer, and National Conservatism is a movement that he's been involved in for a while, and it's also a movement that the Theo Bros have been involved in. Doug Wilson spoke at this conference as well. So you had JD Vance on the stage, you had Doug Wilson on the stage, and this wasn't something that was like thrown together like this minute. These are kind of old, like long-standing relationships. And, JD Vance is like, he is kind of the demographic. I mean, aside from the fact that he's a Catholic, it's kind of confusing that the Theo Bros are so into him, because elsewhere, a lot of them are very disparaging of Catholics. They call them like Mary worshipers. They really don't, they're not into Catholics, but for some reason they think JD Vance is okay. But JD Vance is he's the right age. He's very, very online. And he is, now he's very, very Christian. So it kind of makes sense. I don't know.
But but he has an Indian wife. I mean, like, are they just like, see no evil kind of thing?
This is, it kind of depends who you talk to and what moment you catch them at about this. Like, when I interviewed Stephen Wolfe, who is a Theo Bro who wrote the book, The Case for Christian Nationalism, that kind of made a splash a few years ago, he was saying that America can be open to people of other ethnicities as long as they're willing to conform to our Christian culture. So maybe that's, the excuse that they give for JD Vance's sinful interracial marriage. I don't know. But then elsewhere, like this other Theo Bro, Joel Webbin, who's been saying some really crazy stuff recently, but he was saying at this Theo Bro conference, he went on this whole tear about how it's so offensive to him that he goes to the swimming pool in his neighborhood and there are people in, and I quote, Hindu garb. He's not like hiding it. And, the idea that he's like offended by people in Hindu garb at the pool, but also really likes JD Vance, who has a Hindu wife, it doesn't totally track.
Yeah. So maybe you can connect the dots for us, because one thing I know that a lot of people probably hear in the news is, this term Christian nationalism. So like, are any of the things that you mentioned, whether it's the Theo Bros or the NAR, are they tied to Christian nationalism? And if so, like, well, what are those ties?
Yeah, I think these are two different flavors of Christian nationalism, right? You have the NAR folks with their Seven Mountains mandate, and then you have the Theo Bros who believe that, America, their belief is that America should be ruled by a Christian prince, I think is how they put it. They would like to see a Christian prince rule America. They're two different flavors of Christian nationalism. The NAR movement it's actually pretty diverse. There are female prophets, female apostles. There are Black prominent Black apostles. In fact, a lot of the really high up apostles are in Africa. It's a global movement. The Theo Bros is a little bit more of a provincial movement. These are American guys, and they are, they have a very specific idea of what God wants for America.
I got to ask you, and feel free if you don't feel comfortable answering this, but about your faith background, if any, because the reason I'm curious is because we've spoken to a number of folks who look at this space, whether it's New Apostolic Reformation, Christian nationalism, and I do think that there's a difference between those that study this stuff that have a faith background and those that don't, because I think they come at it from like, I think two different angles, but essentially reach the same conclusion. So I'd be curious to see, how has your faith background, if any, like affected your reporting kind of on these issues?
That's a really interesting question. I was not raised religious. I am culturally Jewish. My mom's Jewish, but even as far back as my grandparents, like nobody was like going to synagogue, like secular Jews through and through. So, I very much admit that I come to this religion reporting from a secular perspective. I am not a person of faith, and I approach it, I think, like I approach any other kind of reporting, where I try to bring my whole self and all of my empathy and all of my best listening skills to my conversations. And I try to report against my biases. If I catch myself expecting somebody to say something or expecting a certain thing to be true, I will do my best to prove myself wrong. I like to think that that's what makes me a good reporter, that I can bring that kind of skepticism to whatever I'm working on.
Do when you speak to congregants or other believers, number one, do they try to pass you tracts? And then two, are you finding yourself having to ask for explanations for some like normal Christianese type of language?
Yes and yes. They pass me tracts and they pray over me. I've had a bunch of folks say, "Can I pray over you?" And I'm like, "Oh, okay, sure. That couldn't hurt, right?" So, and yes, like this, taking on this beat I have had to do some studying up, and NAR and like the Reformed movement, there's so much theology going on there. I had to learn about postmillennialism and premillennialism and dispensationalism and all of that. And it's been quite an education. But even just, Bible stories, I feel like I am at a disadvantage. When somebody says, Christians are called just like Esther, I'm like, okay, who is Esther again? I'm going to look up Esther. And I think that there are great religion journalists out there who are people of faith or have a background in faith, and that kind of just second nature kind of knowledge of all of this theological stuff probably serves them really well.
Yeah, I think it does, but also, if I could offer some words of encouragement to like, don't discount your lack of understanding about some stuff, because it's like the journey that you're going to take your readers on will likely be one that they've never been on before either. So I know, like, kind of early on when I mentioned, hey, we kind of came into this podcasting world not having a clue sort of the actual ties that faith and politics have. And we've kind of been on a journey. We learn more, we read more, and our audience, listeners, watchers that have been there from day one are probably a lot smarter than they were 4 years ago, So I definitely feel where you're coming from, because I wasn't born in the church. I'm married to a a woman who's a PK, pastor's kid. So she was raised in a church. So sometimes I'll bring up this stuff to her, like, oh yeah, they're blowing shofars, and she's like, yeah, like every church does that. And I'm like, really? Like every church? And she's like, no, well, okay, maybe some of the Pentecostals, charismatic, and then she'll start talking in a language that I'm super unfamiliar with. I'm like, you're going to need to pump the brakes because I have no idea what you just said. So, I just think that it's really neat to talk to people that weren't raised in a church covering the space, because you're actually doing a bigger service than you probably think you are.
Well, one of the things that editors hate is jargon, right? So like when you write your stories, and no matter what you're writing about, like when I was writing about COVID and I would write about like antibodies and stuff, like the average person just, maybe now we all know about, now we're all virologists, but
that's true.
I don't know, like just, being able to ask very basic questions, like you were saying, can sometimes be a journalistic advantage.
So, with this upcoming election, what impact do you think, either the Theo Bros or, the NAR folks are going to have on this election? And, and where do you think we would see that impact more than other places?
I think it's hard to read the tea leaves. But on the other hand, you have J.D. Vance appearing with Lance Walnow. This is a prominent NAR guy again. You have, a Trump rally in Lancaster coming up. You have, I just found out about, I'm in Georgia, and some of the NAR pastors are going to do an event with Trump next Monday. I'm trying to go to that. So I don't think it's possible to overstate the influence that these folks have. And it's kind of it works both ways, right? Like, you see NAR pastors like Paula White influencing Trump in his, like during his presidency. Like these folks were surrounding Trump, and they, I think one probably good example, like a concrete example of how they influenced him, was the moving the embassy in Israel from to Jerusalem, which was something that had been important to these NAR folks because of what they believed about biblical prophecies in Israel, and he did it. And at the same time, you have these pastors who are influencing politicians at very high national levels. And then you also have these folks who are in their broadcasts and to their congregations talking about their belief that Trump was anointed by God. So you have a kind of a bottom up and a top down way that they're influencing politics.
Wow. So you mentioned that your next step is to get to Georgia to look at what's happening down there. I guess what are some other stories that you're looking at, connections you're trying to make, if there are connections, and people that you're hoping to kind of speak to kind of further your understanding?
Well, you caught me on a day when I'm like deep in the midst of working on a draft of a story about Christian Zionism. I went to an event, not this past Saturday, but the Saturday before, on Yom Kippur. That's the Jewish Day of Atonement. It took place on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. It was organized by a NAR guy named Lou Engel. It's called the Million Women March rally. I can't remember, but there were not a million women there or a million people. There were estimates range from like 40,000 to maybe 60,000, which is like not nothing. It's not a million, but it's also not nothing. And a big theme of the day was Israel and the kind of post-October 7th need for America and for Christians in particular to stand for Israel, and the kind of equating Trump with this Cyrus biblical figure, Cyrus, who's, going to save Israel. And then, so that's something that I'm working on. I'm writing about that. And then, the election it's very soon. And I'm in Georgia. I live in Georgia, and I am probably going to be doing a lot of Georgia-based reporting, probably around efforts by Christians and probably NAR folks in particular to get out the vote.
Wow. Well, we are going to put links to both of the stories about the Theo Bros and the New Apostolic Reformation in our show notes. So we are definitely encouraging everybody to check those out. And if your story that you were just talking about comes out before this episode posts, we'll make sure we put that in the show notes too. But thanks so much for stopping by, Kiera. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much for having me.
And and to our audience, listeners, as always, make sure you keep your conversations not right or left, but up, and we will see you next time. Take care. Bye.
Hey there, Josh Bertram here, faithful host of the Faithful Politics Podcast. I want to let you know about a compelling new spinoff, the Faith Roundtable, where I'll be interviewing top faith leaders, theologians, and scholars to unpack the pressing issues that are shaping the church in America today. We'll dive into topics like faith in public life, social justice, and how we can engage our communities more effectively. Make sure you don't miss any of our enlightening conversations by subscribing to it on our YouTube channel. Join me at the Faith Roundtable, where deep discussion meets thoughtful insight.